Lecture 3, The Sophists and Social Science, Professor Jeremy Adams.
Sophistry is generally considered in modern vernacular English a bad thing, isn't it? To be a sophist is not good. Sophism is a defective form of thought. All of these terms, sophistry, sophism, sophist itself, designate for most people who think about philosophical issues the wrong way to go. And this, I think, is very unfortunate, historically unfortunate anyway. The sophists who gave their name to this whole structure of words, important serious thinkers of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, were given a very bad name by Plato because his mentor Socrates considered them immoral, intellectually immoral, and sometimes immoral other ways as well. Now, this insult survives in our current English usage, but it is really a misnomer. The Sophists were professional teachers who tried to meet the educational needs of citizens of the Greek city-states of their time. And their time was a moment of social change and of economic and cultural expansion. Athens was the center of the economic life of the Eastern Mediterranean. Athens itself, with maybe 100,000 people, was the largest city in Europe. Athens had recently struggled with the greatest empire in the world, the Persian Empire, and against all odds had defeated it and brought it to a very advantageous kind of a peace. And for that reason, as well as others, Athens had become the center of philosophical thought in the Greek-speaking world. Many of the Sophists came from different places, from many different city-states, but most of them gravitated to Athens for at least part of their adult career, certainly the ones we're going to talk about this morning. These Sophists are in many ways the forerunners of the modern professional intellectual, scientist or humanist. And obviously the forerunners of such a type have got to have something good about them, since the modern professional academic intellectual has to be a model of the way to think and talk and write and so on. No? Or so we like to think. Now, one of the most important things about Sophist thought is its connection with the previous legacy of Ionian thought, particularly in a sense Ionian science. You've already been hearing about the wise men of Ionia, Thales and the other 7 wise men, and their broad speculations on all kinds of topics, which began in those cities of the Eastern Aegean, cities like Miletus and like Ephesus, of which Heraclitus, for example, came of the royal family and was for a while the king. But after the Persians took over the eastern shore of the Aegean Sea, which of course is now western Turkey, many of the thinkers of that part of those city-states fled across the Aegean Sea to Athens. Athens was the mother of many of the colonies of the Aegean polis. Athens was, for example, the mother of Miletus, which was the home of Thales, the first of the 7 wise men, and a setter of their general style of thought. Now, one aspect of Ionian scientific teaching was the conviction that the ethical laws of society, the nomoi, deeply revered by traditional Greek religion and lawmakers, had some basis in natural science. They inhered in the nature of the world in some sense. The Sophists partly disagreed, partly but not entirely. To the Sophists, most, if not all, of the myth-based laws which men revered were artificial, merely conventional agreements. Some laws about human behavior, the Sophist felt, did inhere in nature, in physis, in the physical world. But once rationally analyzed, they turned out to be pretty shocking. And I'll talk about one of those in talking about Thucydides' account of a dialogue between Athenian officers and the representatives of the oligarchic city of Melos on an island in the southern Aegean Sea. An instance of the Sophists' fundamental disagreement with Ionian thought was their abandonment of the objective analysis of nature for the subjective analysis of the human being and of human society. The object which had fascinated the 7 wise men and later Ionian thinkers gave way to the subject, to the human being, man, to use a unfortunately sexist term which was entirely the norm in the extremely sexist society of ancient Greece, man who was then considered the measure of all things, the center of the cosmos in every possible kind of intellectual fashion. Now, Thales himself, Thales, who was born, who knows, about 615 BC, and who traditionally died in 546 BC, when the Persians took over the city of Sardis, not on the coast of Ionia, but inland, the key to the Ionian coast. Thales, for instance, decided that the primal element of the world was water. Water which is available in so many forms, in solid, in liquid, in gaseous forms, and which is evidently necessary to life. And then Thales went on to explain many things by reference to this first premise, to this first principle. The way that the wise men did this was, of course, deductive. They would begin with a general premise, which they would derive through an insight. And then, having formulated this a little bit, they would then deduce from it to all sorts of other things. Thales' pupil Anaximander carried on this tradition. He disagreed with his teacher, as any really good pupil should, and decided that it couldn't be water. It had to be something even more basic, even more fundamental. But because it was so fundamental, it was, in a sense, invisible to the human being. It was not accessible to us. And yet, on the other hand, you could discern primal matter somehow everywhere. Anaximenes' pupil Anaximander, or rather Anaximenes, the pupil of Anaximander, thought that the primal element must be air, and so on and so on and so on. They would continue to speculate. Heraclitus was convinced that everything was constantly in motion, that everything was constantly in flux, nothing was stable. Other Ionian scientists thought exactly the contrary and would develop their theories about the universe in this matter. Now, by contrast, the Sophists of the 5th and 4th centuries BC preferred to speculate analytically about the inner motives of human individual and group behavior. Some examples of sophist analysis which radically challenge traditional opinion are the teachings of Gorgias, of Protagoras, of Callicles, and Thrasymachus. Gorgias was not from the Ionian coast. He was from another zone of heavy Greek colonization, from the island of Sicily, from the polis of Leontini, to be exact. He lived a lot of his adult life in Athens, though, and while there, he wrote a book on, which can be translated as On Non-Being and Nature. And in this provocative book, which he clearly meant to be as outrageous as possible, he argued and seemed to its readers to demonstrate logically that nothing really exists. Now, whether Gorgias really meant this doctrine, whether we ought to consider him a nihilist in the formal sense of the word, or whether he was just using it to prove the absurdity of logical argument, he then abandoned philosophy to teach rhetoric, the art of persuasion. And Socrates meets him in Plato's dialogue, Gorgias, as a professor of rhetoric, who is going to teach the young men of Athens how to be effective in their political campaigns, and effective also, by extension, in their diplomatic or mercantile dealings with people in other parts of the world. Gorgias argued, among other things, that it was much better to simulate certain emotions because they were fundamentally valid. For example, the theater, the dramatic theater, was a matter of great concern to Socrates, who disapproved of it very deeply. He disapproved of the violent emotions which were let loose in it. Gorgias said, no, it's much better to succumb to the emotions of tragic drama, to get seriously upset, for example, by the drama of Agamemnon or of Hecuba. Better to do that, even if you are not even if you fake it a little bit, than to show that you don't have any literary sensitivity. Now, that's exactly the kind of attitude, the kind of posturing, as Socrates would have put it, that so outraged Socrates and that gave Plato the very firm conviction that sophists like Gorgias represented the worst tendencies of human thought. More serious, and sort of almost a friend of Socrates, was Protagoras, whose dates of birth are very uncertain. Some think he was born about 500 BC. Some think by 481. And the one tradition is that he died at the end, or close to the end, of the Peloponnesian War, probably around the year 411. But you get a general sense of a man who pretty much spans that crucial 5th century, in which Athens comes to extraordinary world power by defeating the Persians against all odds, and then loses by losing a more than one generation war with her former ally Sparta, the great and terrible Peloponnesian War. Now, Protagoras can be considered the founder of the modern sciences of linguistics and of social science. People are always trying to find a founder of social science. Thucydides, the great historian, is sometimes called the founder of social science. Montesquieu, the great 18th century thinker, whose division of power into executive, legislative, and judicial was so important to the founders of our own republic, is sometimes called the founder of social science. So's Machiavelli. Why not choose Protagoras to go back to classical antiquity? We don't, of course, have many of the writings of Protagoras or of any of these sophists. Most of what we know about them is reported by a major enemy, Plato, or then by more sympathetic writers with whom we'll be dealing later on in this course. Protagoras was an atheist, although he denied that in public for obvious political reasons. When he was challenged concerning his belief in the gods, Protagoras replied that he knew nothing about them, And he'd prefer to study and to talk about things about which he knew something. For example, the laws and customs of men and the language which men use to convey those, rather than the language which men use to convey in mythic form the stories of the gods, which were for most Greek society the bases of all morality and of all statute law. Protagoras especially enjoyed contrasting law and nature, possibly the most significant sophist departure from the Ionians, the school of Ionian thought, and from the general consensus of respectable opinion in Greece of their time. In this exercise of the contrast of law and nature, he was led to an ever sharper sense of the absurdity of most human traditions and of most human beliefs. Socrates reacted sharply against him. And we have the memory of this in various of the dialogues of Plato. Callicles, of whom little is known, argued, according to Plato, that might is right. It is natural for human beings to be driven by the will to power, the will to power which would be so important for nihilists and realpolitik leaders of European states in the 19th and 20th century, usually the ones we have fought, of course, rather than ourselves. The will to power, which sometimes we've been accused of by our own enemies, was elevated by Callicles the sophist to a position of very high moral standing because of its naturality. I suppose all of this is kind of summed up in the work of Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is a character in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, and he was also an actual sophist. He was not himself an Athenian. He came from an island to the east and came to Athens to teach, and he gathered a considerable following of the young. According to The Republic, he was a guest at the house of Cephalos, the kindly, rich old merchant in the city of Piraeus, the port city of Athens, whose son invited Socrates and two brothers of Plato who were along with him to come spend the night to have a banquet. And the banquet, which lasted until dawn, an extraordinary drinking bout, which produced an extraordinarily long book. That is, if you believe that Plato is basically writing up a banquet that actually happened. Even if he isn't, it's a terrific story. It describes an extraordinary kind of intellectual feast. Socrates debates with various people in the course of this dialogue about the nature of, well, justice, fundamentally. Justice is the central issue. And the first of his opponents, the first of his rivals in debate is Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus, they're moving towards the question of justice. Thrasymachus gets extremely impatient. He's rude, he's rough, he's tough, he's confrontational. And he says that what men call justice is very simply the will of the stronger, or actually of the strongest, the strongest man, the strongest state, the strongest party within a state at any given point. Whoever wins calls what he's done justice, and that's it, and get rid of your illusions. Socrates dismantles him very early on in the Republic by an appeal not to basic human feeling, not to the ancient myths on which the community is founded, but to logic. And by means of an extremely complicated logical argument, which does not convince every modern reader, Socrates demonstrates that this cannot be so. Well, I think that you can see clearly that the kind of thinking represented most bluntly and crudely by Thrasymachus, but represented with greater elegance by Gorgias, greater restraint by Protagoras, with probably comparable bluntness by Callicles, was deeply corrosive to the patriotic and moral myths which had sustained the social cohesion of the polis, of the Greek city-state. The Athenians, for example, required strong belief in the myths of the goddess Athena and the god Poseidon, and a whole body of other myths having to do with the establishment of certain institutions of theirs. The fundamental constitution of Athens was based on stories of the terms which the gods struck with the men who would settle in this particular part of the world under their protection. And it was traditional for Athenian politicians to appeal simply to these sacred stories. Once these sacred stories are dismissed as nonsense, and not only that, but when absolutely contrary moral principles are adduced as the truth, the scientific truth, then you can imagine that at least among the educated citizen class, the stability of the state is in serious doubt. And this helps explain why Socrates reacted so strongly in favor of a logical argument for morality. Morality must be established as something which inheres in nature. Not the kind of nature the Ionians and the Sophists were talking about, not physical nature, but in the physis of the spiritual world, the spiritual nature which Socrates and Plato saw as the primary reality. The Sophists coincided with more than simply the outrage of Socrates. They coincided with the invention of history. Some have said that the Greeks invented history. That's the traditional kind of learning that we get in the West. Some, protesting against this excessively ethnocentric Western view, say no, all peoples have had their histories. And I think it is true that we can certainly find in the ancient Near East very strong evidences of historical writing among the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, supremely among the Jews, whose historical books of the Hebrew Scriptures are very much like what we have come to call history in the West, particularly in the Middle Ages, when Christianity provided a sort of fundamental, if you want, mythic basis for reality. The will of God became the primary motive force in history. The writings of the ancient Hebrews appeared to be fully historical. But the notion that the Greeks invented a new kind of history is, I think, perfectly defensible in front of before anybody. The kind of history that the Greeks invented was a history which attempted to be analytical about causes, to go beyond the will of God or the morality of individual important actors, individual kings, queens, peoples, and so on. The first historian is Herodotus, who was born in 484 and died in 428. He was born in Halicarnassus, another Ionian polis in the eastern Aegean Sea. He moved to Athens for a while, and then he went on to Italy, to the polis of Thurii, where he died eventually after a tranquil old age. And he wrote a great book called simply Historiae, meaning researches. Historiae tended to be researches about geography or about what we would call politics. No one had written up a huge body of Historiae researches, anything like the work of Herodotus. What Herodotus was trying to figure out was the cause of the Greek victory in the Persian War, which just didn't make any sense in terms of resources. And not only the vast resources of the Persian Empire, but the endless tendency of the Greek city-states to squabble among themselves, and of city-states to divide within themselves, as well as to squabble with their neighbors. The great fact was that Athens and Sparta got together. They had not necessarily been hostile much before that, not much more than any other two Greek city-states. They became allies against the Persians, and the Spartan army and the Athenian navy defeated the world's greatest military power. How was this possible? Herodotus goes to work in properly sophist fashion to look at facts. What are the peoples of the world? What kind of peoples do the Persians rule? What sort of peoples are the Greeks? He then moves into a kind of scientific psychology, an analysis of the psychological motivations of the rulers of Persia and the rulers of the Greek world. And fundamentally, I guess, he settles down on psychological causes, but that's narrowing the scope of his work very seriously. It's a very broadly speculative work. It really opens up all sorts of studies which today we call anthropology as well as political science. I don't know why we don't call Herodotus the founder of political science. I suppose he's already called the founder of history, and that one title is thought to be enough for any ancient Greek, I guess. His work is carried on by Thucydides, whose long book on the Peloponnesian War, entitled specifically that, is obviously conscious of Herodotus' work, although he alludes to Herodotus only in very indirect ways. And Thucydides' account of history is much more precise. It has less to do with mythic stories, although Herodotus does present these mythic stories as possible causes. He tends to undercut them at pretty much every turn. Thucydides has very little of that. Instead, he analyzes closely the motivations of the people who led Athens and who led Sparta and their allied states. And he tries to explain certain accidents which seem to him turned the tide of history in the remarkable generation-long conflict that brought his world-dominant city-state down to defeat and to profound humiliation. It's hard to single out any central or final message of this masterpiece of history writing. We can say that Herodotus settles for a kind of science of psychology. Can't focus on any one thing like that for Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. It's very clear, though, as you read the Peloponnesian War, that Thucydides thought that human behavior was very complex, very hard to predict, but fascinating. and that its analysis was the most fascinating exercise of human reason, more compelling than the study of the kind of topics that Protagoras or Gorgias or Socrates or Plato wrote about. And did he think it was useful? Was this a utilitarian science? Probably so. We get the impression that Thucydides thought that understanding the mistakes of the past was a pretty good way to get a sense of how to avoid them in the future. But he doesn't make this a principle. He seems to avoid a formal theory of history. He just presents it analytically, scientifically, in his terms, and lets you come up with your own. Now, one of the most strikingly dramatic moments in the Peloponnesian War, and one in which Thucydides shows his sophist legacy most clearly, is his account of a debate between the officers of an Athenian invasion force and the leading citizens of the oligarchic polis of Melos, a small and strategically insignificant island in the Aegean, in the 16th year of the war. This was militarily a minor event, very minor event indeed, but it exemplified for the author much of Athenian behavior, and it serves as a prime example of sophistic political reasoning. What happens is that the Athenian navy arrives off the coast of Melos. Melos has remained neutral. It is a polis founded by Dorians, so that the Melians consider themselves relatives of the Spartans. And it has therefore not joined up with the other polis, the other city-states that were of Ionian origin, and which naturally joined up with Athens, first of all against the Persians, and then in the Confederate Empire the Athenians established. The Athenians had added other city-states of non-Ionian origin to their empire as well, and they wanted this to become a general feature. So moving away from a kind of ethnic and linguistic connection as the basis of their confederation, they were moving towards something more scientific, if you want. If a city-state was in the area that was important to them, they wanted it to be part of the Athenian alliance. And they go against Melos with quite a considerable expedition. They had 30 of their own ships, plus 36 from the allied polis of Chios, and 2 from the allied polis of Lesbos. All of these Ionians. So with 28 ships, which carried 1,200 hoplites, or heavily armed infantrymen, 300 archers, and 20 mounted archers, all of those Athenians, and about 1,500 hoplites, a larger force from various allies as well. So this is a major invading force, a major expeditionary force in the scale of warfare which the Greeks knew at that time. Now, the generals of the Athenian parties, the Athenian party, the generals were Cleomedes and Tisias. The Athenians like to have 2 people in charge. Generals, we might say admirals as well. They were strategoi. They were commanders of the troops, encamped on the territory of the island of Melos and called for a parley. What they'd hoped for was to present the Athenian case to the assembled people, all the citizens of Melos, and to persuade them that to resist alliance was simply crazy and would do them no good at all. Whereas alliance with Athens would mean, of course, paying the tribute tax, but Athens would then undertake the protection of Melos, and this was a good thing. The Athenians were used to giving out these offers that you could not refuse, and when people refused them, they became extremely unhappy, which was the case right here. Now, Melos, being a Dorian state founded on the model of Sparta, was, of course, an oligarchic state. It did not believe in democracy. An oligarchy, a government of the few, sometimes approved by the mass of the people, but most often self-generating, delegated, and appointed by previous oligarchs, ran things. And the oligarchs said they refused to have the Athenian generals speak to the whole mass of the people. Instead, let the generals talk to them. And the Athenians said, well, okay, if that's how you want to do it, we'll carry on that way. And the argument went on and on. It reaches a very important turning point, I think, more a summary, really, than a turning point, about 2/3 of the way through what must have occupied a long stretch of a very historically decisive day, historically decisive for the Melians at any rate. The Melians say, it's difficult, and you may be sure that we know it, for us to oppose your power and fortune, unless the terms be equal. Nevertheless, we trust that the gods will give us fortune as good as yours, because we are standing for what is right against what is wrong. Because both of these terms, right and wrong, have occurred over and over again in the Melian talk, the Melian presentation throughout this debate. And the Athenians also use these terms, but clearly using them in a kind of respectful, but not quite mocking, but certainly not entirely reverent way either. And as for what we lack in power, the Melians continued, we trust that it will be made up for by our alliance with the Spartans, who are bound, if for no other reason than for honor's sake, and because we are their kinsmen, to come to our help. Our confidence, therefore, is not so entirely irrational as you think. The fundamental notion of the Melians right here is clearly that honor exists, and that kinship exists. Now, we know that kinship exists as an object of physical nature, and the Melians are assuming that honor also exists in the moral nature of the universe. What they're appealing to, of course, is a fundamental value that's been handed down by tradition, and appealing also to the origins of their own community. Their myth was that they'd been founded 700 years before, way back in the 12th century BC, which is entirely possible. But many of these city-states had long records of their kings or their councils or simply of the lines of descent of certain leading families. So there was a certain amount of research to back up these mythic statements. But everyone has to recognize that there was considerable creativity in these genealogies as well as objective science. Well, the Athenian generals answered this way. Now, of course, Thucydides was not there. We don't know if this was Cleomenes speaking or Tisias speaking. Thucydides filled his history with appropriate speeches, speeches of the sort that should have been made. And whether he got pretty good report from people who were there, which is entirely possible, or whether he made it up entirely, it really doesn't matter. Because what this dialogue shows, as does the famous funeral speech of Pericles, probably pretty accurately reported, what all of these famous speeches show is what Thucydides thinks about the motive forces of human behavior. The Athenians say, so far as the favor of the gods is concerned, we think we have as much right to that as you have. Our aims and our actions are perfectly consistent with the beliefs that men hold about the gods and with the principles which govern their own conduct. Our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men, that's a giveaway. Our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men. The kind of distinction Plato will make very strongly in the Republic. Whether that just slipped out of the Athenians' mouths, or whether out of Thucydides' pen, or whether it was already a statement of sophistic character about the relative degree of certitude we can have about the gods and about men is unclear. But I think the message to us is perfectly powerful. Our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men lead us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. A general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. This is not a law that we made ourselves, nor were we the first to act upon it when it was made. We found it already in existence, and we shall leave it to exist forever among those who come after us. We are merely acting in accordance with it, and we know that you or anybody else with the same power as ours would be acting in precisely the same way. And therefore, so far as the gods are concerned, we see no good reason why we should fear to be at a disadvantage. But with regard to your views about Sparta and your confidence that she, out of a sense of honor, will come to your aid, I think you can hear irony here. We must say that we congratulate you on your simplicity, but do not envy you your folly. In matters that concern themselves or their own constitution, the Spartans are quite remarkably good. As for their relations with others, that is a long story, but it can be expressed shortly and clearly by saying that of all people we know, the Spartans are most conspicuous for believing that what they like doing is honorable and what suits their interests is just, the argument of Thrasymachus. And this kind of attitude is not going to be of much help to you in your absurd quest for safety at the moment. The Melians, immovable, answer, but this is the very point where we can feel most sure. What happens is that the Melians stick by their beliefs and hope for their hopes for an Athenian alliance, their hopes for good heavens, for a Spartan alliance. The Athenians, therefore, isolate the town of Melos with a wall they build all around it from the land side. They blockade the harbor, and a long this long siege of attrition goes on. Eventually, the poor Melians attack some Athenians and kill them, and then the Athenians charge. The Melians surrender before the walls have really been taken. All men of military age are killed. All women and children are sold. Melos, in effect, ends, to be resettled later by some survivors, according to another account. One has to wonder how many of those Athenian officers had been pupils of Callicles or of Thrasymachus, and what Thucydides himself thought. I think it's perfectly clear that the sophistic distinction between nature and law based on anything other than strictly rational analysis of human behavior is operative right here in the central statement about how not just Athenians, but men behave.